Take this, brother. May it serve you well.
In 1965, the Reverend David Noble published his essay, Communism, Hypnotism, and the Beatles, as a pamphlet for a little outfit called Christian Crusade Publications. The company was a direct mail outfit run by a radio preacher named Billy James Hargis. Hargis was a segregationist, he was anti-union and anti-communist, and he was also known as a person of interest by the FBI. The pamphlet explores the way that the Communist Party was apparently using hypnosis or brainwashing in order to make the youth of America mentally ill. The party had started up music labels in the mid-40s, and employing artists such as Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie had released records on a variety of labels targeting a variety of age groups. They did this, according to Noble, with the intent of brainwashing and then debilitating the minds of the kids of America. A song such as Tom's Hiccups was supposedly designed to program children into believing that they were destined to suffer from symptom substitution. If a kid got the hiccups and then got rid of them, well, then he would start to sneeze. And if he got rid of the sneeze, it would turn into a yawn. If you got rid of the yawn, it would turn into a snore. And if you got rid of the snore, the hiccups would come back again. There was no escape from illness, and ultimately, no such thing as health. But while we may laugh at Noble's right-wing Christian paranoia today, we should remind ourselves that many people working for much more reputable media outlets than the Christian Crusade believe that Russian memes and tweets put Donald Trump into the White House, and the kinds of progressive organizations that Noble would have hated are today claiming and complaining about pop songs and cooking shows that are indoctrinating young boys into a misogynistic culture. Today's liberal elites seem to share some basic assumptions with David Noble of the Christian Crusade. Noble concocted his conspiracy theory about a communist plot to brainwash America through pop music creatively, but there were some facts scattered throughout his paranoid screed. Pete Seeger was not a hypnotist whose music was designed to make American children mentally ill, but he was a member of the Communist Party. And Alexandra Luria didn't write about nerve jamming exactly, but he did write about his success in creating disorganization in human behavior. And he did consider this disorganization to be a kind of artificially generated neurosis. The pieces of the Beatle conspiracy, taken separately, have some validity. Pete Seeger, while sweet and naive, was deemed by even mainstream centrists as a useful idiot for Stalin. And the Beatles' music did lead teenagers to act out violently. The boys and girls at their concerts often worked themselves up into such a frenzy that riots ensued.
There have been huge crowds of teenage girls outside complaining that they don't want to mob you, they just want to speak to you. What do you think about this? Do you want to talk to them?
Well, have you ever tried talking to about 200 people at once?
We'd love to, you know. If we all wave and somebody always says, stop that waving, you're inciting them.
Of course, all this together, as laid out in Noble's essay, doesn't add up to anything, or not to what he claims it adds up to. There was no evidence that Luria contributed to or composed the music on Pete Seeger's records, and there was no connection between Seeger's record label and John, Paul, George, and Ringo, at least none that I'm aware of. What Noble didn't imagine was that there might have been a larger social dynamic at work, and that the Beatles, Pete Seeger, and even Stalin could more easily be considered symptoms than causes for the social disintegration he experienced so acutely. What he really couldn't allow himself to think was that the social disintegration he deplored included some moments of improvement and liberation. What was at work in the 60s, the material changes that created the social disturbances Noble was railing against, included the introduction of the pill in 1960, low unemployment, and an increasingly affluent white consumer class in America. the creation of the shopper, the shift from citizenship to consumption, was a symptom of its own, and given how Noble and his Christian crusade arrived on the scene through the expansion of commercial radio and direct mail marketing, his conspiracy theories were as much a symptom of social disruption as the Beatles were. If we want to discover a conspiracy to explain this shift, to explain the destruction of national identities based on communal practices and religious values, if we want to look for a culprit behind the construction of a hedonistic consumer society based on conspicuous consumption, well, we could find one. The progressives had planned for and celebrated the rise of the consumer since at least the late 19th century, and by the time the Roaring Twenties came around, economists and planners like Hazel Kirk and Teresa McMahon were advocating for the creation of a new type of man, a man willing to work hard, not to meet his needs, but in order to assure a life of luxury.
It's always important, in fact, to confront one's opponents, to confront ideas you don't like in their most compelling form. I don't want to argue that this was only a materialistic belief. On the contrary, I mean, Adam Smith, who's quite clear about this, makes it explicit that when he talks about productivity, he is also interested in the expansion of human culture that is required to support an increasingly productive system, so that this vision of a marvelously productive machine based on an endlessly expanding demand for what once were luxuries monopolized by the privileged. These new wants included taste for not just material comforts and conveniences, but the tastes that go along with education, with rising levels of taste, and so on. So that it's a quite generous belief that has plenty of moral content as well as material.
However, if one allows a more mechanistic understanding of the operations of capitalist society to be considered, if we move past a critique of ideology alone and try to be materialist in a Marxist sense, that is, if we consider how we act out our ideas through collective production, we might be able to see our way clear of a conspiracy theory version of history. Hello, Zero Books readers and viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. In this video, we'll be setting up an exploration of Hegel and Marx's materialist dialectic by taking on an objection from Corneilius Castoriadis in his book, The Imaginary Institution of Society. We'll begin by taking an excerpt from Michael Brooks' book, Against the Web, but first, here's a word about our Patreon. If you enjoy these videos, you should click on the subscribe button and hit that bell. Even better, you should support us on Patreon. Patreon supporters get access to our Parrot Room, or private podcast conversations, as well as to podcasts about Rosa Luxemburg's Reform and Revolution, Gilles Dauvé's From Crisis to Communization, and Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. Support us on Patreon and join us in learning critical theory with the aim of changing society. In his book Against the Web, Michael Brooks observed that the new conservatives like Jordan Peterson and Stephen Hicks, while deeply disturbed by the alienation, fragmentation, and disruption of cultural continuity brought about by late capitalism, nevertheless express an enthusiastic commitment to free markets. Hicks, of course, rejects the idea that free market capitalism is responsible for the fragmentation and disruption of cultural continuity. He rejects a materialist understanding of human nature altogether and views it as antithetical to the principles of liberal democratic individualism that he champions. In an essay called Marx's Philosophy and the Necessity of Violent Politics, Hicks rejects what he calls Marx's environmental determinism. He claims that the idea that a person's consciousness is determined by their productive social relations leads to a rejection of the Enlightenment principle of reasoned public discourse. It leads the Marxist to commit and valorize violence. The argument Hicks puts forward hinges on a gross misreading, so I won't bother with it all here. However, it is worth noting one aspect of his idea, namely his argument in a roundabout way that if the ideas we arrive at are determined by our economic system, this means they are not, at base, reasonable. The anti-Bolshevik, radical anti-capitalist, and anti-Marxist Corneilius Castoriadis reached the same conclusion, though his critique is much more philosophically sophisticated. In his book, The Imaginary Institution of Society, he wrote, "While history appears as the place of conscious actions of conscious beings, Engels claimed that history is a domain of unconscious intentions and unintended ends. The real results of men's historical action are, as it were, never those the authors had wanted. What poses a major problem is that these results, which no one intended as such, are presented as being coherent in a certain way. They possess a meaning and seem to obey a logic, which is neither a subjective logic, carried by a consciousness, posited by someone, nor an objective logic, like that we think we see in nature. Instead, Engels offers us an historical logic." For Castoriadis, a former Marxist, the difficulty is that an unconsciously operative and unintentionally produced system of commodity relations was thought to lead, inevitably, to its own transcendence and to the conscious and political development of socialism. Even more, according to Castoriadis, a society that operates along accidentally derived economic principles, that functions behind our backs through commodity production and exchange, could only be constructed through a process of trial and error. Without a clear aim, human societies could be seen to develop cultures, religious beliefs, educational institutions, political systems, familial arrangements, in much the same way that evolution produces species, that is, through a process of failures. But, as Castoriadis claims, we don't find a mass of failed societies behind us, but rather a litany of coherent societies that, when they encountered stronger societies from the outside, were wiped out. What's more, the societies that we find have characters and meaning, quite apart from the mere productive practices and market calculations from which we are meant to believe they arrived. We might look back on the 50s and 60s and decide that the consumer society that emerged did so as a solution to the problem of overabundance of both wealth and value after World War II. It was a way to maintain high levels of production, even as the workers' needs could be met in less time and with less work. But to do so reduces the music of the Beatles, the entrepreneurial cunning of Ray Kroc, the creativity of Draper Daniels, to the level of dominoes falling in a sequence. Each one somehow caused by an internal logic understandable to us through economic categories. History is thereby robbed not only of any sense of meaning or significance, but it becomes a stage without actors, a play without a language, sound and fury signifying nothing. In the end, Castoriadis concludes that Marx's move from the economic categories of material production to the level of politics and culture can only be accomplished through an embrace of a Hegelian dialectic that he asserts always contains an anthropomorphic assumption or an unjustified humanism that is, ultimately, a mystification or a religious principle. And that brings us back to the beginning. If Marx's critique of political economy can be reduced to a conspiracy acted out by a bourgeois class, if the values of society aren't to be found in our material production, but in our ideas and ideologies, then we are not very far away from the explanations of the Beatles offered up by cranks like David Noble. We have found our way from reason back to mythology. Ultimately, if there's something to Marx's ideas other than resentment and critique, we'll have to defend not only Marx, but also Hegel from Castoriadis and his criticisms. You can look for that defense in our next video. And in the meantime, you might take a look at our previous video on Castoriadis and his notion of the imaginary. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel, and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.